A single decision can shatter a kingdom. High King Fingon stands on the windswept ramparts of his fortress, his gaze locked on the distant, menacing peaks where his greatest enemy waits. He has just rejected a final offer from the Dark Lord Morgoth, a choice that hurls the Elven realms into an irreversible war. This is not just a conflict of armies. It is a gamble that risks the very land beneath their feet, a continent already scarred by ancient strife and haunted by the relentless whisper of the sea. By the end of this story, you will understand the true cost of pride and the epic tragedy of a world lost beneath the waves. What ancient grudge could demand such a terrible price? And where might you be right now, listening as this tale begins to unfold? What does the sound of the sea bring to your mind? The war horns had not yet faded from the air when Fingon summoned his most powerful lords. In a great chamber of stone, lit by the flickering light of many torches, he stood before them. His voice was not that of a diplomat seeking consensus. It was the voice of a king who had already made his choice. He spoke of their long exile, of the theft of their most precious jewels, and of the unending shadow Morgoth cast upon the land. He demanded a unified assault, a final, glorious war to break the gates of Angband and reclaim their birthright. His words were like sparks on dry tinder, igniting the ancient fire in the hearts of his people. A chorus of agreement rose from many in the hall, their own pride and pain amplified by the High King's passion. But in the shadows at the edge of the chamber, other voices remained silent. The more cautious lords, those who remembered the sheer, unassailable power of the enemy's fortress, saw not glory, but ruin. They saw the folly of throwing their entire strength against a mountain of iron and fire. This descent, this first crack in the foundation of their alliance, was far more dangerous than any open enemy. Fingon was now caught between his burning need for vengeance and the grim counsel of prudence. To press his authority and silence the doubters would secure his army, but shatter the fragile unity of the Noldor. To heed their warnings felt like a betrayal of his own fiery words. With a final, decisive command, he chose the path of war. The decision was made. The fate of the Noldor was now irrevocably tied to a conflict that would demand a price far greater than any of them could foresee. As the war horns sounded again, their call was answered by a low, distant rumble from the north, as if the very mountains were groaning in response. Across the vast plains of Ard Galen, a sea of silver and steel began its march. Fingon's host moved with a purpose that seemed to defy the very desolation under their feet. Once a vibrant green land, the plains were now a scorched and blackened expanse, a testament to Morgoth's breath of fire. The elven banners, shimmering in the uncertain light, looked like defiant stars against a field of ash. Their advance was swift, a blade aimed directly at the heart of the enemy's domain. Soon, the vanguard clashed with Morgoth's outriders, bands of orcs and twisted wolves that harried their flanks. In these first, sharp engagements, the skill and fury of the Noldor were undeniable. They cut through the enemy lines with a fierce grace, their initial victories singing a siren song of invincibility. Each skirmish won fed their confidence, making the ultimate victory feel not just possible, but inevitable. Yet with every league they advanced, the land itself seemed to resist them. The scorched earth offered no forage, and their supply lines stretched back over a terrifying distance, becoming thin, vulnerable threads connecting them to a homeland that felt increasingly remote. The very successes that emboldened Fingon began to create a terrible dilemma for his army. The captains who had counseled caution now watched with grim faces as their forces pushed deeper into a barren wasteland. To press onward meant driving the spear further into the enemy's territory, but it also meant exposing their flanks to a counterattack that could sever those vital supply lines and trap them in a land of dust and death. To halt and consolidate their gains felt like surrendering their hard-won momentum, giving Morgoth the time he needed to muster his true strength from the depths of Angband. Fingon stood at the head of his army, the weight of the decision a colder burden than any armor. He chose to push forward. It was a choice born of momentum, of pride, and of the desperate hope that one final, decisive battle lay just beyond the horizon. But as his forces redeployed, stretching ever thinner to answer his command, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. It was not the familiar thunder of their own cavalry. This was a deeper, more ominous vibration, a rhythmic shudder that seemed to rise from the world's core. It was the sound of drums, great war drums beaten deep within the earth, a hidden menace signaling that the real power of the Dark Lord was now awake and on the move. The thunder of the drums was answered by the ring of elven steel as Fingon's army surged forward, finally reaching the stark, towering peaks of Thangorodrim. They encircled the dark fortress of Angband, a ring of defiant light around a mountain of shadow. Siege engines of wood and silver were hauled into position, their great arms creaking as they hurled stones against the iron gates. Elven magic wove through the air, not as a gentle art, but as a weapon of pure force, a brilliant, shimmering assault meant to crack the foundations of the enemy's stronghold. Yet for every spell that struck the black walls, a deeper, colder power seemed to absorb the blow. The gates did not yield. The mountains stood unmoved. What began as a glorious assault settled into a grim, grinding stalemate that stretched from one year into the next, and then into many more. Seasons cycled outside the siege lines, but within that blasted landscape, time seemed to congeal into a single, endless moment of watchfulness and want. The Noldor host, once a brilliant blade, was now a rusting chain, bound to a fortress it could not penetrate. Their supplies, carried over such great distances, dwindled. Morale, that bright flame of their initial fervor, began to gutter and fade under the relentless, oppressive shadow of the enemy. They were not fighting an army anymore, but a mountain, and a mountain does not tire, does not feel despair. This was a conflict of endurance against an immovable foe, and with each passing season, the elves could feel their own strength slowly ebbing away. High King Fingon faced a choice with no good answer. He could order a final, desperate frontal assault, a move that would cost countless lives for a chance, however slim at victory, or he could maintain this war of attrition, a slow, draining process that risked the total exhaustion of his people's strength, leaving them as hollowed-out guardians of a prison they could not break. His pride warred with a dawning, chilling pragmatism. To commit everything to one attack was a gamble that could end their race in these lands. To do nothing was to watch his kingdom wither on the vine, becoming too weak to even hold the line. The stakes were no longer just victory or defeat, but the complete and utter consumption of the Noldor spirit. and from the depths of Angband, a new threat began to stir in response to their prolonged presence. It was not the marching of armies or the beating of drums this time, but something far more insidious. A foul, greasy smoke began to seep from hidden vents in the mountainside, coiling through the elven camps. It was a vapor of despair, a chemical misery that sapped the will and turned dreams into nightmares. This was Morgoth's true answer to their siege, not a counterattack, but a slow poisoning of the air itself, proving that his power could reach them even from behind his unbreakable walls. The first crack in their defenses was not in the stone, but in the heart of a trusted captain. For years, the pass at Ethel Sirion had been considered unbreachable, guarded by loyal sentinels and the formidable character of its commander. But the slow poison of Morgoth's influence works not only through the air, but through whispered promises in the minds of the weary. This captain, worn down by the grinding despair of the siege, and tempted by visions of power offered in his darkest dreams, made a choice that would echo through history. On a moonless night, he gave the order to stand down, opening the hidden mountain path to a host of orcs that moved with a silence that was itself a weapon. The slaughter of the elven guards was swift and merciless, their warning horns cut off before a single note could sound. By the time the alarm was raised, the enemy was not at the gates, but deep within the primary defense line, turning a position of strength into a bloody trap. When the news reached High King Fingon, the report was not of a battlefield loss, but of a profound sickness within his own ranks. The crisis was no longer merely military. It was a venomous strike at the very idea of trust. His captains demanded immediate and brutal justice, a public execution to scourge the betrayal and reaffirm his authority. Yet Fingon hesitated, staring not at maps of the front lines, but into the chilling truth this act revealed. If one of his most trusted commanders could be so utterly corrupted, then who else might be vulnerable? Morgoth's greatest assault was not the army that now poured through the pass, but this insidious doubt, this seed of fear planted in the soil of their fellowship. To execute the traitor was a necessary act of war, but to do so without understanding how he fell was to ignore the disease while merely treating a symptom. His decision was a terrible balancing act. The traitor was condemned, and justice was seen to be done, a grim message to any who would contemplate a similar turn. But in private, Fingon ordered a deeper inquiry, a quiet, desperate search for the roots of this spiritual decay. He had to know if this was an isolated failure of one elf spirit, or the first sign of a deeper, more widespread corrosion. This choice escalated the stakes of their war beyond swords and sorcery. It was now a battle for the soul of his people, fought in the shadows of their own hearts. And as if the land itself were bound to their moral fray, the first true physical cracks began to appear. Far to the west, along the coast, scouts reported new fissures in the earth, not caused by quake or weapon, but seeming to open like wounds from the world's core. Seawater began to seep into the lower valleys of Beleriand, a slow, silent encroachment that mirrored the dark tide now flooding their ranks. The sky itself seemed to tear open. From the volcanic peaks of Thangarodrim, Morgoth did not send forth an army, but an apocalypse. The ground split with a roar that drowned out the war drums, and rivers of liquid fire, the dagger Bragalach, poured across the scorched plains. This was not a battle to be fought with sword and shield. It was a force of nature commanded by hatred, a deluge of flame that consumed the elven siege lines in an instant. From the fiery fissures emerged horrors unseen for centuries, the Balrogs, beings of shadow and flame, whose very presence was a terror that could break the strongest spirit. High King Fingon's meticulously held formations, the pride of the Noldor, shattered against this onslaught. There was no strategy left, only survival. The glorious host was now a scattering of desperate figures silhouetted against a world on fire. Elven lords who had sung songs of valor under the stars were now cut down by whips of flame, their shining armor offering no protection against the sheer, annihilating power of the enemy. The vast territories they had guarded for centuries were lost in a single, brutal day, the land itself sinking beneath waves of flame. Fingon, riding through the chaos, found his kingship reduced to a single, terrible calculation. To sound the retreat felt like an admission of total defeat, a betrayal of every warrior who had already fallen. Yet to order a final stand here, on this burning plain, would be the end of his people. It would mean the extinction of the Noldor kingdom in Middle-earth, the final note in their long, tragic song. His decision was not one of glory, but of grim necessity. The silver horns of retreat sounded, a mournful cry against the cacophony of destruction. It was a call to abandon the dead, to flee from the ruins of their ambition, and to salvage whatever broken pieces of their nation remained. This was no longer a war for victory, but a fight for the barest thread of survival. As the survivors fled south, the fire and shadow pursued them, an unending tide. And with the very foundations of the land broken by this cataclysm, the sea, which had been patiently waiting at the edges, found its opening. The first great gulf of ocean began to rush into the wounded continent, a chilling parallel to the flood of darkness now engulfing the elves. The rivers ran black with ash, a grim and flowing shroud for the fallen. Through this desolation, Fingon led the tattered remnants of his host in a desperate fighting withdrawal. Every step south was a battle, a series of brutal rearguard actions fought on burned earth, where the very air was thick with cinders and the cries of the enemy. His army was no longer a force of conquest, but a shield, its sole purpose to protect the fleeing survivors who clung to the last flicker of hope. This grim retreat was a tactical success, a masterful display of a king's duty in the face of utter ruin. He saved a core of his people, bringing them at last to the towering stone walls of his fortress, Ethel. But the cost was the entire north. The gates were left unguarded, the vast plains and hidden valleys now laid open for Morgoth's legions to claim without a fight. Within the high halls of the fortress, a silence more terrible than the roar of battle settled over the king. The weight of his crown felt like a physical burden, forged from the twin metals of duty and shame. He had saved his followers, yet he had lost a kingdom. His every instinct screamed to fortify their position, to pour all their remaining strength into making Ethel an unbreakable redoubt. To seal the gates and prepare for a final, glorious defense felt like the only honorable path. But honor was a luxury he could no longer afford. His scouts brought whispers of movements in the east and south, of other elven realms still standing, their strength untested. To reach them, he would have to dispatch his swiftest riders on a perilous journey through lands now crawling with the enemy, further weakening his own defenses at the very moment a counter-assault seemed most likely. This was the cruelest choice of his reign. To keep every warrior within the walls was to ensure their immediate safety, but to accept total isolation, a slow strangulation, as the noose of Morgoth's power tightened. To send riders was to gamble the lives of those he protected, risking his fortress for the slender chance of a salvation that might never come. His decision would define the future of his people, not as a glorious chapter in a song, but as a desperate entry in a ledger of survival. He chose to send the riders as the secret gates opened and the messengers vanished into the gathering dark. A new kind of vulnerability gripped the fortress. They were now truly alone, a single point of light in a drowning shadow, waiting for an answer to a call they could not be sure had been heard. The riders did not return alone. With them came a host unlike any the elves had seen, a people who walked with the dust of the mountains still upon their cloaks. They were led by a chieftain named Hador, a man whose voice carried the weight of open skies and whose eyes held the certainty of a short, fierce life. His people, the Edain, had crossed the perilous peaks, drawn by tales of the Elven kings, stand against the shadow. They did not come as refugees, but as warriors offering their spears and their lives in a shared fight. For Fingon, their arrival was a sudden, tangible hope, a reinforcement of mortal strength to shore up his failing immortal defenses. The great fortress of Ard Ethel, which had felt so empty and vulnerable, now echoed with the unfamiliar sounds of a different tongue and the rough, honest laughter of men. Yet this new alliance was a blade with two edges. The disciplined, ancient ways of the elves clashed with the bold, impulsive courage of mortals. An elven captain would plan a patrol with meticulous care, considering every shadow and silence over a span of centuries. A captain of the Edain would see the same ground and advocate for a swift, decisive strike, arguing that speed was a weapon the enemy would not expect. In the war councils, this friction grew from a whisper to a constant tension. The elves saw the recklessness of a race that lived and died in a heartbeat. The men saw the caution of a people who had forgotten how to risk everything. Fingon now presided over a council divided not by betrayal, but by the fundamental nature of its members. He had to forge a single strategy from two different kinds of time, two different understandings of what it meant to lose. His decision on how to wield this new force would define the next stage of the war. To keep the men segregated as a separate, expendable vanguard would be to dishonor their oath and waste their unique ferocity, but to fully integrate them into his own regiments, to ask immortal elves to fight shoulder to shoulder with soldiers they saw as fleeting and unpredictable, risked shattering the very cohesion of his army. The choice was no longer just about tactics. It was about faith. Fingon looked at Hador and saw not a temporary ally, but the future of this land. He chose to trust them. He gave the Edain their own banners and a place of honor in his battle lines, a testament to their valor and a gamble that their mortal fire could reignite the ancient flame of the Noldor. In doing so, he bound the fate of his people irrevocably to theirs. The hope of the elves was now intertwined with the destiny of men, a fragile thread of light spun from two very different sources. And as this new alliance was tested in skirmishes along the besieged borders, a new whisper began to circulate among the highest elven lords, a rumor carried on the sea winds from the distant west. It spoke of a hidden power, a land of the gods that lay across the sea, untouched by the shadow, It was a rumor of salvation, a possible haven if all was lost. But to the proud High King, who had just staked his hope on the courage of mortals, it was also a seductive whisper of retreat, a final, bitter alternative to the war he had sworn to win. The pact was sealed not with a grand ceremony, but in the flickering torchlight of the fortress's deepest council chamber. Fingon stood beside Hador, their hands clasped over a map of the bleeding continent. This was the Council of Union, a solemn oath that bound the fate of the immortal Noldor to the mortal Edain in a shared vow of mutual defense. Together, they began to trace lines of attack on the parchment, a bold plan for a new offensive meant to reclaim the Lost Plains. The air in the room was thick with a fragile hope, the first they had felt in years. Yet beneath the surface of this new alliance, a fundamental schism began to show. For the elves, this war was a timeless struggle for a lost homeland, a conflict measured in centuries. For the Edain, it was a fight for the very ground their children would walk on, a desperate need for a victory within their own lifetimes. Hador and his captains argued for immediate, overwhelming force, a single, glorious battle to break the enemy's advance. Why wait and let the shadow grow stronger, they questioned, when courage could win the day. The Elven lords, their memories long and filled with the cost of past rashness, counseled a strategy of fortified defenses and patient pressure, a war of endurance they believed only they could win. Fingon listened to both sides, the weight of the decision settling upon him like a physical mantle. To adopt the defensive posture felt safe, a preservation of their remaining strength. But it was also an admission that they were merely waiting, ceding the initiative to an enemy who grew stronger with every passing season. To risk the combined army in Hador's proposed counterstroke was to gamble everything, the last free peoples of Beleriand, on a single throw of the dice. There would be no retreat from such a commitment, no second chance if the gambit failed. He made his choice. They would take the offensive. The decision sent a jolt of grim energy through the fortress, a mixture of elven resolve and mortal fire. But as the allied host prepared to march from the gates, a new, unsettling report arrived from the western scouts. The coastal settlements were being abandoned. The sea, no longer a distant murmur, was now a constant, hungry roar at their backs. The land itself was shrinking, the shorelines crumbling into the waves, as if the continent were sighing in its final agony. Their great gamble was not just against the armies of Morgoth, but against the relentless turning of the world, a race against a drowning tide. The decision to strike was a desperate gamble, and the target was the scorched highlands of Dorthonion. Fingon himself led the raid, a silver-clad figure riding into a land of ghosts. His objective was not to claim territory, but to snatch lives from the shadow's grasp, to rescue the scattered bands of elves and men who were being hunted like animals in the burning pine forests. The mission was a tactical nightmare, a deep thrust into enemy-held lands where every ridge could hide an ambush. Yet they fought with a ferocity born of necessity, cutting through orc patrols to reach the fortified caves where the survivors huddled. The sight of the High King's banner, tattered but still flying, brought a hope so profound it was a physical force, pulling the desperate from their hiding places. They succeeded. A river of refugees, gaunt and hollow-eyed, was guided back toward the relative safety of the southern lands, but the cost was etched in the empty saddles of the knights who had ridden in. For every life saved, a seasoned warrior had fallen. The rescue was a victory of mercy, but it felt like a bleeding wound in their military strength. Fingon returned to Barad Ethel with the grateful survivors, his triumph shadowed by a grim calculation. He had proven his compassion, but he had also risked the entire defense of his realm for a single act of salvation. His captains were divided. Some argued that every life was worth the price, that their very purpose was to protect the people. Others saw only the cold arithmetic of war, the slow drain of their best fighters in operations that did not weaken the enemy. This was the new, cruel conflict Fingon faced, the choice between the heart of a king and the mind of a general. Could he afford to be merciful when every lost warrior brought Morgoth one step closer to their gates? As if in answer, the land itself groaned. During their retreat, the very ground of Dorthonion had shuddered and split, not from fire or weapon, but from a deep, sickening collapse. Whole swaths of the highland forests, once vibrant and strong, simply slid into newly opened chasms, their fall accompanied by a sound like a continent dying. The earth was not just scarred, it was terminally ill, its foundations giving way. This was no longer a war just against Morgoth. The world they were fighting to save was crumbling under their feet, turning every act of heroism into a race against an inevitable tide. How many more such rescues could the land endure before there was nothing left to stand on? The sky wept a thin, corrosive drizzle, stinging the eyes of the allied host as they formed their battle line. From the east came their new allies, the Easterling clans led by Ulfang, their grim faces and sturdy spears a welcome addition to the thinning ranks of elves and Edain. They had sworn oaths of loyalty, their chieftain kneeling before Fingon with solemn vows that seemed to echo the pact made with Hador. The High King, his trust already stretched thin, had accepted their strength with a cautious hope. He placed them on the right flank, a position of honor and vital importance, trusting their numbers to hold the line. The initial clash of the battle was a storm of steel and desperate courage. The center, held by the loyal Edain and Elven knights, pressed forward against the enemy's main force. For a few fleeting hours, it seemed the tide of war might finally turn. They could feel the enemy lines straining, ready to break. Then, without warning, the sound of their own war horns changed. The call from the right flank was not one of advance or hold, but a shrill, twisted signal of betrayal. Ulfang and his entire host turned their spears inward. They did not merely retreat, they actively charged into the exposed side of the allied center, their blades cutting down the very men and elves they had sworn to fight beside. The perfect formation dissolved into a swirling nightmare of confusion and slaughter. The allied center, caught between the anvil of Morgoth's main force and the hammer of Ulfang's treachery, was utterly crushed. Fingon, fighting to rally his crumbling lines from the left, watched in horror as his army's heart was torn out. This was not a defeat born of enemy strength, but of a poison delivered by a handshake. The crisis that faced him in the aftermath was more insidious than any battlefield loss. His first, furious instinct was to purge his ranks of all Easterlings, to see every foreign face as a potential dagger waiting to strike. Yet to do so would be to surrender to the very paranoia Morgoth sought to sow. It would shatter the fragile trust he had built with Hador's people, making every ally feel suspect. He had to respond with a justice that was both swift and precise, a surgical cut to remove the cancer without killing the patient. His decision was a masterstroke of cold political necessity. He publicly condemned Ulfang and his kin as oath-breakers, their names erased from all records and songs, but he did not turn on the other Easterling clans who had fought with honor. Instead, he praised their loyalty, drawing a clear line between the traitor and the faithful. This choice prevented a wider collapse of his alliance, but it came with a terrible cost. A new, silent wall of suspicion now stood between every commander. Every tactical discussion, every deployment of troops, was now shadowed by the unspoken question: could they be trusted? The battle was lost, but the greater war was now a conflict fought in the shadows of every oath and every hand offered in friendship. As the acid rain continued to fall, washing the blood of the fallen into the cracked earth, it felt as though the heavens themselves were weeping for the death of honor. The silver and blue banners of Fingon's house guard snapped in the bitter wind that whipped through the pass of Sirion. This was the final, vital artery into the Elven heartlands, and the High King poured his finest warriors into its stony throat. They were not an army, but a living barricade, a wall of skill and sacrifice. For one long, brutal season, they held. The narrow defiles ran red with the blood of orcs, and the sheer cliffs echoed with the defiant songs of the elves as they met each new assault. Yet every glorious defense came at a terrible price. With each enemy wave that broke upon their spears, another seasoned captain fell. Another warrior of 1,000 years' experience was lost. These were soldiers who could not be replaced, their wisdom and power bleeding away into the cold stone. Fingon received the casualty reports in his hall far to the south, each scroll a heavier weight than the last. He was winning every battle, but losing the war one irreplaceable life at a time. The strategic dilemma was a cruel vise. To reinforce the pass was to feed his best remaining troops into a relentless meat grinder, sacrificing the future of his military strength for a few more weeks of ground. But to order a withdrawal, even a phased and careful one, was to unlock the gate. It would surrender the last natural barrier and invite the shadow directly into the fertile valleys and hidden refuges where his people had sought safety. The heartland itself, the cradle of their culture, would lie exposed. His decision would be a choice between a slow, honorable death and a potentially catastrophic gamble. He chose to hold the line. He sent more of his elite guard north, condemning them to the same grim fate, buying precious time for his people to prepare for an invasion that now felt inevitable. And as if the land itself wept for his choice, the skies opened. Unending rains fell, and the rivers, fed by the torrents, began to swell. The Sirion, their great river and a symbol of their realm, burst its banks, not with life-giving water, but with a churning, destructive flood that mirrored the desperate tide of battle upstream. The rain fell in gray sheets, a weeping sky for a dying land. From the highest tower of Barad Ethel, Fingon watched his kingdom dissolve, not just in fire and shadow, but in water. The rivers were now enemies, the seas a rising threat. His pride, that brilliant, stubborn flame that had ignited this war, now felt like a cold, dead ember in his chest. He had gambled everything on his own strength, on the valor of his allies, and he had lost. The only power left that could stand against the tide of Morgoth was one he had spent his entire reign ignoring, a power that lay across the sundering seas in the blessed realm of the Valar. To even consider asking for their help felt like a final, shattering admission of his own failure. Yet the alternative was to preside over the complete and utter extinction of his people. It was no longer a choice between victory and defeat, but between swallowing his pride and facing annihilation. He made the call. He summoned his last, most skilled mariners, the few who still remembered the star paths across the trackless ocean. In the dead of night, he gave them his final command, a mission that seemed more like a prayer than a strategy. They were to take the last 3 seaworthy ships, vessels that were their final connection to the wider world, and risk the impossible voyage to the undying lands. They were to beg the gods for an army, for a miracle, for anything that could turn the tide. This was not a deployment of resources, it was a sacrifice. Those ships could have been used to evacuate his people, to ferry them to some distant, safer shore. Instead, he was casting them into the maw of the western gales, on a journey from which they would likely never return, for a hope that was thinner than mist. As the small fleet vanished into the pre-dawn gloom, a profound silence fell over the harbor. The stars above, which had always been a constant guide and comfort to the elves, seemed to flicker and grow dim, as if the very heavens were holding their breath, waiting to see if a king's humility had come too late. The silence of waiting was shattered by a sound no elven ear had ever truly known. It was a deep, grinding roar that tore through the air, a vibration that felt less like noise and more like the sky itself being ripped apart. From the broken peaks of Angband they came. Glorung, the first of the great dragons, led a brood of winged fire, a new kind of army that did not march, but flew. Their scales were iron, their breath a liquid ruin that melted stone and boiled rivers. The strongholds that had withstood sieges for centuries were now mere kindling. Entire cities, repositories of ancient lore and song, were reduced to lakes of fire in a single, horrifying pass. Fingon's response was a frantic surge of innovation against this raw, overwhelming force. He summoned his most courageous hunters, arming them with specially forged lances and massive, wheeled ballistae that could hurl spears the size of tree trunks. These were not soldiers, but dragon slayers, a new and desperate profession born in the shadow of extinction. Their first, costly victories were small sparks of hope. A young dragon, overconfident, would dive too low and be impaled by a volley of ballista bolts. A team of hunters, sacrificing themselves, would manage to pierce a vulnerable scale with their enchanted lances. But for every beast that fell, 3 more took its place, and Glorung himself seemed to mock their efforts, his ancient cunning anticipating every trap they laid. This forced a terrible strategic choice upon the High King. To confront the dragons directly meant committing his entire remaining force to a series of open field battles where the enemy held the sky. He would be fighting on their terms, a gamble that could annihilate his army in an afternoon. The alternative was to devise a stratagem, to try and divert the great worms away from the populated heartlands. He could use decoy forces to lead them on wild chases, or attempt to lure them into pre-prepared killing zones in the barren northern wastes. But such a plan was a delay, not a solution. It would save his cities temporarily, but leave the dragons free to burn the countryside, the very fields and forests that fed his people. He chose the stratagem. It was a decision of cold calculation, placing the immediate survival of his citizens above the long-term health of the land. His riders, the bravest of the brave, rode out as living bait, leading the dragon brood on a furious chase across the plains. The plan worked in the most terrible way possible. The cities were spared a direct assault, but the diverted dragons vented their fury on the world itself. They set the great forests of region aflame, a fire so vast its smoke blotted out the sun for weeks. They scorched the farmlands of Estelad into a glassy, barren crust, ensuring a famine would follow the fires. This managed destruction, this calculated sacrifice, felt like a new kind of defeat. Fingon had saved his people from immediate immolation, but in doing so, he had unleashed a fire that consumed their future. And as the continent burned from within, the sea continued its patient work from without. With the land weakened and scarred, the coastlines began to crumble in earnest, great cliffs of ancient stone, surrendering to the waves with a roar that rivaled the dragons themselves. The war was now being lost on two fronts, one of fire and shadow, the other of relentless, rising water. The final muster was a sight of heartbreaking splendor. On the wide, wind-swept field of Tumhalad, the last banners of the Noldor stood beside the tattered standards of the Edain. Here was Hador's heir, his face set with the grim resolve of his fallen father, and beside him stood High King Fingon, his silver armor reflecting the dull, stormy light. This was not the glorious host of the early wars. It was a gathering of survivors, a final, desperate union of all who still dared to defy the shadow. Their combined strength was formidable, a glittering spear point of the world's last free peoples. Yet, by gathering in one place, they had made themselves the single greatest target in all of Beleriand. The very act of uniting, meant to inspire hope, also painted a bullseye on their hearts. The tension in the command tent was palpable. The younger captains, both elf and man, burned with the desire for a final, glorious charge. They argued that only a decisive victory could turn the tide, that their combined fury could break the enemy's spine. The older, wearier lords saw a different path. They whispered of dispersal, of scattering their people to the hidden havens along the coast. It was a strategy of survival, not victory, an admission that the war was lost, but the people might yet be saved. Fingon listened to both sides, the weight of 6 centuries of kingship crushing him. To seek a decisive battle was to risk everything on a single throw of the dice. If they lost, there would be no one left to defend the havens, no one left to carry on the memory of their people. It would be the end, but to order a general retreat was to surrender the heart of the continent without a fight. It was to abandon any hope of victory, to consign their homeland to the darkness forever, saving their lives but sacrificing their very reason for existing. His choice would define their legacy. Would they be remembered as the cautious souls who fled, or the proud defenders who fell? He made his decision. They would stand and fight. The horns sounded not a call to advance, but to form ranks, to dig in upon that open field and await the coming storm. It was a choice for glory, for honor, for the slim chance of a miracle. And as the order echoed across the plain, the ground began to tremble. It was a low, rhythmic shudder that grew with every passing moment, a vibration that climbed from the soles of their feet into their very bones. It was the sound of countless iron-shod boots, the march of an army so vast it seemed the land itself was moving against them. The ultimate gamble had been called, and the enemy was coming to collect. The rhythmic thunder of the enemy's approach became a single, deafening roar as Morgoth's legions crested the hills, a wave of iron and hatred that blotted out the horizon. Fingon met this tide with a wall of elven steel and mortal defiance, his own banner a brilliant point of light in the gathering gloom. The initial clash was a storm of disciplined fury. Under the High King's direct command, the Allied lines held firm, their formations shifting with an ancient grace that turned aside the enemy's brute force. Fingon himself was everywhere, a silver wraith in the heart of the chaos. He dueled a towering Balrog upon a mound of the slain, his sword a blur of white fire against the creature's shadow and flame. In that moment, he was the king of old, a living legend holding back the night with sheer force of will. His courage was a contagion, and for a fleeting hour, it seemed the impossible might happen. The line held, but legends are fragile things against overwhelming numbers. The enemy did not have one Balrog, but many. It did not have a single army, but a seemingly endless reserve that poured onto the field, surrounding the allied host on three sides. The disciplined formations began to buckle under the sheer weight of metal and malice. The field of Tumhalad, chosen for its open ground, became a trap. It transformed from a place of desperate hope into a slaughterhouse. The green grass churned into red mud under the relentless press of combat. This was the crux of Fingon's torment, the conflict between honor and survival made horrifyingly real. To sound the retreat now would be to abandon the center of his line, the brave Edain who were being systematically butchered, their heroic last stand turning into a massacre. It would be to stain his honor with the blood of his most loyal allies, yet to fight on was to commit every last soul on that field to death. There would be no survivors, no one left to carry the memory of this day, no one to defend the women and children waiting in the hidden havens. His kingship, his very reason for being, demanded he stand and die with his men, but the pragmatist who had learned the hard cost of war screamed for him to save what he could. The decision was a rending of his own spirit. He chose survival. The silver horns of retreat sounded, a mournful, desperate cry that was almost swallowed by the din of battle. It was not an order of cowardice, but one of unbearable responsibility. It meant leaving thousands to die so that a handful might live. As his guard fought to extract him from the collapsing center, a final, personal tragedy unfolded. Hador's heir, surrounded and cut off, fell beneath a swarm of orcs, his standard trampled into the bloody mire. The alliance of elf and man, forged in such hope, was broken in that moment, its heart torn out on the field. The retreat became a rout, a bloody scramble southward, and as the last of the allied survivors fled, the skies, which had been a bruised purple, opened with a cold, relentless rain. It fell upon the countless dead, washing their blood into the soil, where it gathered in streams that flowed westward toward the sea. It was as if the lifeblood of the continent was pouring into the ocean, a final, grim offering that seemed to summon the waiting tides, beckoning them to come and claim what was left. The roar of the retreating horns was a lie. Fingon knew it. There was no true escape from this field, only the chance for a few to run while others held the line. He stood now, his silver armor dented and smeared with ash, his personal guard a shrinking ring of light in an ocean of shadow. And then the sea of orcs parted, and the Lord of Balrogs, Gothmog, emerged. The air itself curdled with the heat of his presence, a being of pure, ancient malice made manifest in whip and flame. This was no longer a battle of armies, but a duel of fates. Every instinct of a king, every strategy honed over 600 years, narrowed to a single, brutal calculation. To yield, even in death, was unthinkable. His only choice was how he would spend his final moments. He could fight to personally slay the Balrog, a feat that would echo in song for ages, or he could use his last breath to create a barrier, a distraction so absolute it would grant every possible second for his people to flee. He chose the latter. With a final, defiant cry that cut through the din of battle, he charged not to kill, but to be killed. He met Gothmog's fiery whip with his own blade, not in a duel of finesse, but in a raw, desperate clash meant to draw every eye, to focus all the enemy's fury upon himself. It was a king's final command, and his order was his own death. The struggle was swift and terrible. His sword flashed, but the Balrog's power was a force of nature. The flames enveloped him, and the High King of the Noldor fell. His sacrifice worked. In the precious minutes that Gothmog and his retinue were occupied with the king, the shattered remnants of the allied host found a sliver of opening in the encircling tide. They broke through, a ragged stream of survivors fleeing south, carrying with them the terrible news. The light of their leadership had been extinguished. The consequence of his sacrifice was immediate and devastating. With Fingon gone, the last unifying figure of the Elven resistance vanished. The chain of command shattered into a dozen pieces. Captains now fought their own isolated battles, their coordination broken, their hope extinguished with their king. They were not just an army in retreat, they were a people adrift in their darkest hour, utterly leaderless. And as if in mourning, the land itself enacted its own final, terrible echo. The great mountains that had formed the spine of Beleriand, their foundations already weakened by centuries of war and sorcery, began to groan. With a sound that dwarfed the roar of the battle, the peaks of Thangarodrim themselves shuddered and started to collapse, their mighty slopes sliding into the valleys below. The fall of the king was mirrored by the fall of the very land he had fought to save, a dual collapse that signaled the true, final end of an age. The salt on the wind was the first taste of the end. It stung the lips of the fleeing elves, a bitter promise from a sea that was no longer a boundary, but a looming fate. With Fingon's fall, the heart of their resistance shattered. There was no longer a single command, no grand strategy, only a primal, desperate flight. The proud regiments of the Noldor splintered into 100 scattered bands, each captain now a king of the lost. Some fought a frantic, rearguard action, selling their lives in handfuls to buy minutes for others to escape. Many more were simply overrun, their bright banners trampled into the mud, their songs silenced as they were dragged into the shadows of Angband. This was not a retreat. It was a dissolution, the unmaking of an army and the civilization it protected. The conflict for each survivor was no longer against orcs or balrogs, but an internal war between the crushing weight of despair and the raw, animal instinct to live. In the chaotic aftermath, a grim council formed among the few remaining captains. Their debate was short, brutal, and held over the bodies of their comrades. One faction argued for a final stand, to gather every last soul and make a fortress of their own bones in the path of the enemy. It was a choice for memory, for a clean end sung in fire. The other, larger faction saw the cold truth. The war for the interior was over. To stand was to die and be forgotten. Their only duty now was to the future, to the faint hope of preserving a remnant of their people. They had to abandon the heartland, the ancient forests and hidden cities of Beleriand, and fall back to the very edge of the world, the coastal havens like the mouths of Sirion. This decision felt like a betrayal of every mile of soil they had fought for. It was a conscious surrender of the continents, soul to the shadow, but it was the only choice that offered a thread of continuity, a chance that their story might not end here, on this bloody field. As they turned their backs on their homeland and began the long, sorrowful march to the sea, the wind shifted. It no longer carried just the smoke of burning forests, but the thick, heavy scent of the ocean. The salt in the air was no longer just a taste. It was a presence, an advancing breath that seemed to say the sea itself was coming to finish what the war had begun. A slow, sorrowful river of refugees now flowed south and west, a stark contrast to the proud armies that had once marched north. The ancient cities, their spires empty and their halls silent, stood as tombs to a lost age. Hithlum, Dorlaman, and the hidden valleys of the Ard Galen were abandoned, their people carrying only what their backs could bear. This was not a retreat, but an exodus, a final, heartbreaking admission that the war for the heart of Beleriand was over. The journey itself was a gauntlet of grief, each step away from a homeland etched with the names of ancestors and the memories of centuries. Parents pointed out distant, fading peaks to their children, whispering stories of a home they would never see again. The leaders guiding this desperate flight faced a terrible new kind of conflict. One fought not with swords, but with heartbreaking choices. What do you save when your world is ending? A soldier might choose his sword, but a king must choose the seeds of a future. The great libraries of Gondolin held scrolls of unparalleled lore, the very history of their people. The forges of Nargothrond contained tools and techniques that could not be replicated, but a cart that carries a heavy stone of knowledge cannot carry an extra sack of grain. A ship that holds a chest of ancient jewels has no room for another family. Every choice was a sacrifice, a quiet amputation of their own culture for the sake of bare survival. Do you preserve the song that tells of the first sunrise, or the seed that will grow the first crop in a new land? This internal struggle, this conflict between memory and necessity, forced them to confront the ultimate truth with every item they packed or left behind. They were not just fleeing an enemy, they were accepting that their homeland was already a ghost, and they were its last, fading breath. And as this river of the displaced reached the coastal regions of the Falas and the great Isle of Valar, they found a fragile sanctuary, but also a haunting new reality. The thunder of the waves against the shore was a constant reminder that the sea, which had once been their boundary, was now their only possible escape route, and a relentless, rising threat. The ocean seemed to sense their retreat, its hungry tides clawing ever further inland, as if following the footsteps of the fleeing, claiming the abandoned lands left in their wake. The very roads they walked began to dissolve beneath their feet. What began as a gentle lapping at the shoreline transformed into an insatiable hunger as the sea, stirred by the world's deep wounds, rose to claim the coast. The ports of the Falas, their stone quays once bustling with life, were now submerged under churning, gray water. their broken towers standing as lonely tombstones. The refugees found themselves trapped between a wall of advancing shadow and a floor of rising ocean, their flight turning into a desperate navigation of a drowning world. Ancient forest paths they had used for centuries were now choked with salt water and tangled seaweed, forcing them onto higher, more exposed ground where the enemy's scouts roamed freely. The conflict was no longer just against Morgoth's armies, but against the very earth and water. Every decision at a flooded crossroads was a gamble with their lives. Do they risk the treacherous open sea in the few remaining leaky boats, trusting their fate to the mercy of the storm-racked waves? Or do they attempt the longer inland routes, where orc patrols and the crumbling landscape present their own mortal dangers? This was a choice between a quick, potential drowning and a slow, grinding death. The air itself became a part of their sorrow, a thick, salty mist that clung to their cloaks and hid the sun, a perpetual shroud that made every breath a reminder of the ocean's cold embrace. In this new war against nature, every safe mile gained felt like a miracle, and every lost path a sentence, as the continent of Beleriand sighed its last, watery breaths beneath them. The last safe harbor became a final battleground. Morgoth's legions, a tide of black iron, swept down upon the elven havens, crashing against the wooden palisades and stone quays where the last of the ships lay anchored. The defenders, a mix of weathered mariners and desperate refugees, fought with a ferocity born of absolute necessity. They turned their own vessels into weapons, raining arrows from the rigging and using the ship's great ballistae to hurl flaming projectiles into the massed ranks on the shore. For a time, this desperate ingenuity held the line, the sea at their backs both a shield and a prison. But the enemy's numbers were endless. Siege towers, monstrous constructs of black wood and nail, were rolled forward, and soon the outer defenses were overrun. The fighting spilled onto the docks themselves, a chaotic melee of splintering wood and ringing steel, where every plank was contested. The consequence of this fierce resistance was the systematic destruction of their only hope. Orcs with torches clambered over the moored ships, setting sails and hulls ablaze. The proud fleet, the last means of crossing the sea to safety, became a pyre, its burning timbers casting a hellish glow on the churning water. Thick, black smoke choked the air, and the screams of the dying mixed with the crackle of the inferno. The escape routes were vanishing before their eyes, each burning vessel a door slamming shut. The commanders, their faces streaked with soot and sweat, faced a choice with no good outcome. To fight to the last elf and man was a noble end, a final act of defiance that would be sung of for ages. But it would also mean the total extinction of their people in this place, the snuffing out of the last light. The alternative was a desperate breakout by sea, a frantic scramble onto the few remaining, less seaworthy craft, and casting themselves onto the mercy of the open ocean, a journey that promised almost certain drowning in the storm-racked waves. This impossible decision escalated the final stakes, from a battle for a haven to a battle for the seed of a future. Choosing to flee meant abandoning the wounded and the rear guard to a terrible fate, a moral wound that would never heal. Choosing to stay meant a clean, honorable death and the absolute end of their story. As the last commanders gave the order to abandon the docks, the harbors filled with a new kind of wreckage. Not just the scorched skeletons of ships, but but the floating detritus of an ended civilization, shattered shields, broken spears, and the silent, still forms of those who had bought this desperate, costly escape with their lives. The water itself became a tomb, and the survivors who pushed off from the burning shore were now utterly trapped, caught between the army at their backs and the boundless, hungry ocean ahead. A light appeared on the western horizon, not the gentle glow of dawn, but a piercing, brilliant radiance that tore through the smoky haze. The host of the Valar had come. Their ships were like floating mountains of pearl, and their warriors shone with a light that was a physical force against the shadows. Where their armies landed, the tide of battle turned instantly. The orc legions, which had seemed an unstoppable flood, now recoiled and burned away like mist under a sudden sun. This was salvation, a miracle arriving in the final, desperate hour. Yet with every divine footstep that struck the soil of Beleriand, the land trembled with a new, deeper violence. The very ground, already fractured by centuries of war, could not bear the concentrated power of these god-like beings. The conflict was no longer just between elf and dark lord. It had escalated into a clash of primal forces, and the continent itself was the battlefield. The elven survivors now faced an agonizing choice. The Valar summoned them to a final, absolute war, a direct assault on Angband that promised total victory, but would unleash powers capable of shattering the world. To join this war was to embrace their own destruction for the chance to destroy Morgoth. The alternative was a bitter retreat, to gather the last precious remnants of their culture, their songs, and their people, and to flee eastward, abandoning their homeland to its fate. This decision forced them to weigh the cost of victory itself. Was it worth saving the world if the very act of saving it meant that world would be torn apart? As the host of the West marched north, their passage left more than defeated enemies in its wake. It left a broken landscape, canyons splitting the earth where their power had clashed with the enemy's fortifications. And the sea, responding to this celestial turmoil, began to churn and boil along the coasts, as if the ocean itself were rising in a fever to match the land's final agony. The earth did not just shake, it screamed. The war of wrath was not a battle between armies, but a collision of worlds. The Valar, beings of primordial power, brought their full might to bear, and the land of Beleriand could not endure it. Their host, joined by the last desperate elves and Edain, met Morgoth's final legions on the plains of Anfaglyth, and the sound was that of a continent breaking its own spine. Mountains were thrown down as mere rubble, and valleys were scooped out to become new seas. At the center of this cataclysm stood the three volcanic peaks of Thangorodrim, Morgoth's throne and fortress. The Valar assailed it directly, and in a final, unimaginable convulsion, the mountains themselves were torn from their roots. The dark towers of Angband were unmade, their iron gates melting like wax in a furnace, and Morgoth, the source of all the long shadow, was at last wrestled from his deep throne and cast out beyond the circles of the world, a defeated spirit hurled into the timeless void. Victory was absolute, but it tasted of ash and salt water, for with the fall of the Dark Lord, the last supports of the wounded continent gave way. The foundations of the earth, already fractured by centuries of conflict, and this final divine assault cracked open. The sea, which had been patiently gnawing at the edges, now rushed in with a triumphant, terrible roar. The survivors huddled on the few remaining highlands, watched a new kind of terror unfold. The very ground they stood on was dissolving into the waves. This presented a choice more desolate than any they had faced in war. Do they celebrate this hard-won victory, even as the stage upon which it was won vanishes beneath them? Or do they mourn the price, a world saved by being utterly unmade? The conflict was no longer about survival against an enemy, but about finding meaning in a victory that felt indistinguishable from total loss. The fate of the continent was now sealed, not by a dark lord's malice, but by the very forces that had come to save it. How do you build a future when the past is actively being erased by the ocean? Mile by drowning mile, the ground did not simply break, it dissolved. A victorious cheer died in the throats of the survivors, replaced by the deafening groan of a continent dying. Before their eyes, the plains of Anfaglith, the stage of their final victory, tilted and slid into the sea. Mountains that had stood since the world's dawn crumbled like sandcastles before a tide, their majestic peaks vanishing beneath churning, gray waves. This was not a flood, it was an unmaking. The very history of the elves was being physically erased. Every forest, every river, every hidden city consumed by the relentless ocean. The conflict now was a terrible, internal one, a war between memory and survival. Do you stand on the highest peak of your ancestral home, singing its songs until the water claims you, becoming a permanent part of the legend? Or do you turn your back on the sinking ruins, on the graves of your kings and the cradles of your children, and run for any patch of earth that still holds firm? This was not a choice made in council, but in every individual heart, a desperate calculation between a noble death and a guilt-ridden life. Every moment became a frantic race, the stakes measured in the rising waterline. A family might pause to grab a single heirloom from a drowning house, only to find the path behind them already gone, swallowed by the advancing sea. The sound was a constant, horrifying roar, a reminder that the victory over darkness had come with the ultimate price tag, the complete and total loss of the world they had fought so long to save. How do you build a new future when the foundation of your entire past is actively vanishing beneath your feet? Their final voyage began not with a cheer, but with the groaning of strained timbers. Every seaworthy craft, from the grandest swan ship to the humblest fishing skiff, was laden with the last of the elves and Edain. They pushed off from shores that crumbled even as their oars bit the water, leaving a continent of ghosts in their wake. The sea they faced was a tempest of grief and fury, a churning chaos of waves that seemed to resent their escape. Great whirlpools opened without warning, spinning ships like toys, their masts tracing desperate circles against a sky the color of bruised iron. The conflict was no longer against an army, but against the raw, untamed power of the world itself, a test of seamanship and courage where a single mistake meant a watery grave for all aboard. Hope was a fragile flame in the heart of each mariner, fed by the memory of the land they had lost. Despair was the constant, freezing spray that stung their faces, the sight of a neighboring vessel vanishing into a gaping vortex, its passengers' cries swallowed by the wind. This journey forced upon them choices more personal and agonizing than any battlefield command. A captain might have to decide between cutting a lifeboat loose to save his overloaded ship or risking everyone to haul the survivors aboard. A family might be forced to jettison a chest containing their entire ancestral history the physical weight of their past, threatening to drag them all into the abyss. Each decision was a brutal calculation of what was essential for the future. Do you save the aged lore master who holds the old songs in his mind, or the young mother with an infant who represents the people yet to be? These were not strategic choices, but moral wounds that would never fully heal, escalating the stakes from mere survival to the very soul of their civilization. They were deciding, in those desperate moments, who would be left to bear the memory of Beleriand into the unknown. And as the storms finally began to subside, the horizon offered no comfort, only an endless, empty expanse of water, a void that mirrored the hollow feeling in their hearts. Had they traded a drowning continent for a boundless ocean, only to be lost forever between a vanished past and an unseen future? Above the churning chaos, a single light pierced the weeping sky. It was the star of Eärendil, a brilliant point of hope, born from the heart of a Silmaril, carried on his ship, Vingalad. As his vessel ascended, transformed into a celestial beacon, it cast its first gentle radiance upon the world below. Yet that same light illuminated a terrible finality. Where the proud peaks of the Ard Galen had once clawed at the clouds, only the tips of mountains remained, like the grasping fingers of a drowning giant. The sea closed over them without a sound, swallowing the last physical proof of Beleriand. In that single, breathtaking moment, the refugees witnessed the birth of a new star and the death of their entire world. How do you mourn a continent? The question settled over the survivors not as a shout, but as a profound, unsettling quiet. The old stories, the ancient grudges, the very maps they had lived by, were now meaningless, rendered fiction by the patient, all-consuming ocean. Their conflict was no longer about fighting for a home, but about carrying its ghost. Do they spend their remaining ages singing elegies for the drowned, letting their culture become a museum of loss? Or do they take the memory of the light, the hope that Eärendil's star represents, and forge something entirely new from the wreckage? This choice would define their legacy far more than any battle. To cling only to the past was to remain anchored to a seabed, to live as permanent exiles. To embrace the future was to accept that their greatest age was behind them, a price that felt like a second betrayal. The new star shining over the empty sea was a guide, but it was also a reminder of everything that was gone, a bittersweet resolution that promised a dawn only after the longest and most final of nights. The salt-crusted hulls of their ships scraped against not sand, but the roots of drowned mountains. They had reached the only land left, the extreme eastern edge of what was once Beleriand, a long, narrow strip of coast backed by sheer cliffs. This was Lindon, a final, broken bone of a lost continent. The survivors stepped onto the shore with a silence heavier than any battle cry, their feet finding purchase on the grave of their entire world. The work of building began not with grand designs, but with the grim necessity of survival. They salvaged splintered timbers from their own beached vessels and gathered stones from the crumbled cliffs, raising the first rough shelters against the relentless sea wind. This new kingdom was founded not in glory, but in grief, its very soil a memorial to all that had been consumed by the waves. The consequence of this fragile foothold was a profound cultural schism that emerged almost immediately. The older elves, their hearts still anchored to the drowned cities of Gondolin and Doriath, sought to rebuild what was lost. They constructed halls that echoed the architecture of their lost homes and sang only the old songs, their melodies filled with a sorrow that seemed to slow time itself. The younger generation, however, who had known little but war and flight, saw the blank slate of this new shore. They argued for new forms, new songs, and new ways of living, unburdened by the weight of a past that had, in the end, brought only ruin. This forced the new leaders, like Gil-galad, who now bore the weight of kingship, into an impossible choice. Should he sanction the meticulous recreation of a lost world, giving his people the comfort of familiar beauty, even if it was a ghost? Or should he encourage innovation, allowing their culture to evolve into something new, something that might finally be free of the ancient shadows? This was not a simple debate about art or architecture. It was a decision that would set the course for all future generations. To cling only to memory was to build a museum, a beautiful but static monument to a finished story. To embrace pure change was to risk severing the last threads to their identity, to become a people without a history. Gil-galad's choice would determine whether Lindon became the tomb of the Noldor or its cradle. He chose a middle path, a delicate and difficult balance. He allowed the old songs to be sung in the great halls, preserving the lore and language of Beleriand. But he also gave his blessing to new settlements further inland, where new styles could be forged and new stories could begin. This compromise escalated the stakes of their survival, from the physical to the spiritual. They were no longer just fighting to live, but fighting to decide what their lives would mean. And as the first new leaves began to sprout on the war-scarred hillsides, a remarkable thing happened. The tides, which had roared and clawed at the land for so long, finally stilled. The ocean's hunger seemed sated, its relentless advance replaced by the gentle, rhythmic lapping of a sea at peace. The drowning was over. In the sudden, profound quiet, the survivors could finally hear the sound of their own future, waiting to be shaped. The sea that had been their destroyer now became their only road. Upon the newly formed shores of Lindon, a profound choice presented itself to the survivors, a decision that would cleave the peoples of Beleri, and forever. From the undying lands in the west came a summons, a pardon offered by the Valar. Any elf who wished could now board the white ships and sail into the west, to a land of peace and timeless bliss, leaving the sorrows and scars of Middle-earth behind. For the Edain, the mortal men who had fought and bled alongside them, a different reward was granted, a great island set apart for them in the sea, a kingdom of their own called Numenor. This parting of the ways forced every individual to weigh their deepest loyalties. Was their hope tied to the future of this wounded world, or to the memory of a lost paradise? For the elves, the choice was between the peace of the past and the purpose of the present. To sail west was to seek healing, to rejoin the company of their kin in the land of the gods, to finally lay down the unbearable weight of centuries of war. It was a return to the light, but to remain in Middle-earth was an act of profound commitment. It meant embracing a diminished world, accepting that the age of their greatest glory had drowned, and choosing to become its guardians, its hidden shepherds in the ages to come. They would watch forests rise and fall, kingdoms of men flourish and fade, all while carrying the unending memory of a continent that was no more. Theirs would be a long, slow twilight, a choice for lingering responsibility over personal peace. The mortal Edain faced a different kind of dilemma. Their island gift of Numenor was a tangible promise, a reward for their valor, and a chance to build a society free from the shadow of Morgoth. Yet to accept it was to be physically separated from the elven allies who had shaped their destiny. They would have to learn to rule themselves, to navigate their own path without the ancient wisdom of the firstborn to guide them. This separation introduced a new conflict, one of destiny versus choice. Was the fate of elves and men always meant to diverge, or was this parting a tragic necessity, a consequence of a world broken by war? Each person who stood on that shore had to decide where their hope truly lay. For the elves, the sea became a bridge to their origins. For the Edain, it was a moat around their new beginning. And for those few who chose to stay behind in Middle-earth, both elf and man, the sea became a permanent barrier, a rolling gray wall that stood between them and the lost paradise of their legends. The legacy of Beleriand was thus scattered to the winds. Its light was carried west in the hearts of the departing elves. Its courage was carried to the island kingdom of men, and its memory was entrusted to the steadfast few who remained, a seed planted in the soil of a new age. With every ship that vanished over the horizon, the stakes of their survival escalated from mere existence to the stewardship of an entire world's history. What would flourish from such a fragmented inheritance? Generations later, the sound of the sea was a constant murmur beneath the words of the lore masters. They gathered in the twilight of the new age, in halls of wood, where once there had been stone, their hands tracing maps of lands that existed only in memory. Their great work was the compiling of the Chronicles, a desperate race against the slow erosion of time itself. The oldest among them could still recall the scent of the pine forests in Dorthonion, or the exact timbre of a lost king's voice. But for the younger scribes, these were just stories, their sharp edges softened by retelling, their truths blending with the sheen of myth. This created a quiet, profound conflict in the scriptorium, a struggle not over ink and parchment, but over the soul of a lost world. Do you record the full, flawed humanity of the heroes, their pride and their desperate choices, or do you polish their legends into flawless icons of a bygone golden age? The choice before them was immense: to emphasize the grim realities of the war, the betrayals and the costly sacrifices, was to preserve a painful, cautionary truth. It risked making the past seem a dark and sorrowful place, a burden too heavy for new generations to carry, yet to smooth over the cracks, to tell only of undimmed glory and noble ends, was to build a beautiful lie. It would offer comfort, but at the cost of the very lessons carved from ruin. This decision escalated the stakes of their labor from simple record, keeping to the guardianship of meaning itself. They were deciding whether Beleriand would be remembered as a real, breathing world that was lost, or as a perfect, untouchable dream. In the end, their quills moved across the vellum, recording both the light and the shadow. They wrote of Fingon's valor and his pride, of the glory of the Edain and the sting of betrayal. They understood that a sanitized history would be a second death, a final drowning of the truth beneath a placid surface of song. And so the waves that had taken the land now whispered back the old names Hithlum, Doriath, Gondolin, not as a lament, but as a promise that even a drowned world could cast a long shadow, its echoes shaping the destiny of all the ages to come. The roar of the sea at last softened to a whisper. Over ages uncounted, the churning waves settled into a gentle, rhythmic pulse, against the new shorelines, and the raw wounds of the world slowly scarred over with soil and fresh, green growth. Forests of oak and pine marched across hills that had once been the fire-scorched frontiers of war, and rivers ran clear again, their waters no longer choked with the ash of fallen kingdoms. Yet beneath the placid blue expanse, the bones of a continent lay hidden, a vast and silent tomb for the glory of the Noldor, the valor of the Edain, and the terrible pride of kings. The descendants of those who had escaped the drowning carried this knowledge like an heirloom of sorrow, a weight that shaped their every glance toward the horizon. They built their new lives upon the easternmost edge of the lost world, in the land of Lindon and the realms beyond, their cities humble in comparison to the legendary spires of Gondolin or the hidden halls of Doriath. Their hope was not a brilliant, blinding flame, but the steady, enduring light of a star seen through mist, a quiet determination to guard the peace they had purchased with so much blood. This commitment forged a new purpose, a vigilant watch against any shadow that might again gather in the east. They became the guardians of memory, their very existence, a lesson carved from the heart of a drowned world. But what is the true lesson of such a loss? Is it to build higher walls and sharper swords, preparing only for the next war? Or is it to understand the slow poison of pride, the fragility of trust, and the terrible cost of an oath sworn in reckless fire? The choice they made in those first years of the New Age would ripple through the long history of Middle-earth. To learn from the Drowning of Beleriand was to accept that some victories are not won by shattering the enemy, but by the quiet, daily acts of preservation, by nurturing the light in simple things. It meant that the greatest honor to the fallen was not an endless lament, but a promise to protect the world that remained from the same tragic fate. As the first light of a new sunrise broke over the green hills of a world reborn, it fell upon a people forever changed, carrying the ghost of a continent in their hearts as they stepped forward into the unwritten story of the ages. The last peak of the Ard Galen was a shrinking island in a churning gray sea. On its highest crag, a final ragged circle of elves and men stood together, their hands clasped not in strategy, but in farewell. Before them, the waves swallowed the last visible spires of Gondolin, the fabled hidden city that had stood for centuries, vanishing beneath the water without a sound. To the south, the ancient, enchanted forests of Doriath were now a submerged labyrinth, their golden leaves drifting in silent currents far below. The salt spray that stung their faces tasted of lost kings and forgotten songs. In this final, shared moment, the grand causes and ancient grudges that had defined their long war felt as hollow as the drowned halls beneath the waves. They were not facing the enemy they had fought, but the direct, undeniable consequence of their own choices. The pride that had rejected parley, the oaths that had demanded absolute victory, the very glory they had sought, had all paved the road to this single, shrinking point of rock. A bitter curse against the unfairness of fate rose in more than one heart, a final, furious refusal to accept this end. But as they looked at the faces beside them, elf and man, their differences washed away by the same rising tide, that fury began to cool into a profound and chilling clarity. To curse their fate was to die as they had lived, in defiance of a reality they could not control. To accept it, however, was to finally understand the war's true lesson. They had begun as warlords, believing the world was a thing to be conquered and claimed. Now, with nothing left to claim, they became something else entirely. They became guardians, not of land or jewels, but of memory itself, the weight of their shared history, of every sacrifice and every loss, settled upon them not as a burden, but as a sacred trust. Letting go of the land was the price for preserving its story. One by one, they released their grip on the need for vengeance, on the dream of reclaiming a lost golden age. In that release, as the cold water swirled around their ankles, a strange and quiet peace descended. It was not the peace of victory, nor the peace of surrender, but the peace of understanding. They had fought, they had lost, and they had loved the world enough to mourn it properly. The last of the land slipped away beneath the relentless sea, but the circle of hands held firm, a final, fleeting monument to a continent that would never truly be gone as long as its echo remained in the heart. The great sea finally stilled, its surface a vast, unbroken blue that hid entire kingdoms beneath its tranquil face. All that remained were a few scattered islands, the highest peaks of drowned mountains, and the long, lonely coast of Lindon. The continent of Beleriand was gone, its cities silent, its forests extinguished, its wars and glories erased from the very map of the world. Yet in the halls of the survivors, a different kind of geography was being drawn, one not of stone and soil, but of memory and music. The elves did not let their world die a second death in forgetfulness. They wove its history into song, each melody a thread connecting them to the lost halls of Gondolin, the glittering caves of Nargothrond, and the final, desperate courage on the field of Tumhalad. In these songs, High King Fingon was not merely a fallen warrior, but a symbol of the terrible price of leadership. His sacrifice, a permanent lesson in the cost of pride and the necessity of hope. The Edain, in their new island home across the sea, told their own tales of the Great Alliance, of Hador's oath, and the bitter cost of betrayal. These stories became their inheritance, more valuable than any jewel, for they carried the wisdom of a lost age into the future. This legacy, forged in the fires of war and tempered by the drowning waves, became a guiding star for all the ages to come. It taught that while kingdoms of stone can fall, the light carried in the heart is far harder to quench. The long struggle between light and shadow did not end with the sinking of Beleriand. It simply changed ITS Chinese letter. The vigilance born from that loss would shape the guardians of Middle-earth for millennia, a quiet watch against the darkness, always remembering the whisper of the waves that forever carries the echo of a world that was. you.